Hello and welcome to the 100th episode of Seeking Answers. I just want to take this time to thank you all for the support over this journey and these 100 videos. And what better way to celebrate this incredible milestone than discussing, arguably, the most infamous assassination in human history. On May the 29th, 1917, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, later known as JFK, was born in Brookline, Massachusetts to parents Joseph and Rose, the eldest of 8 children. His father was a businessman and politician, while his mother a philanthropist and socialite. In 1927, the family relocated to Riverdale, New York, where they would remain until John would turn 18. In September 1935, JFK travelled over to England hoping to attend the London School of Economics. Unfortunately, he faced some ill health and had to return home to the States, leading to him instead enrolling at Princeton University in October. Unfortunately, this also didn't last as he suffered some gastrointestinal illness and was once again forced to drop out. In July the following year, John attended Harvard College and he went on to graduate 4 years later with a BA in Government and International Affairs. He did intend on enrolling at Yale Law School but ended up withdrawing due to the start of the Second World War. Instead, JFK attempted to enlist in the army, but due to his chronic back problems, he was disallowed on medical grounds. In 1941, John joined the staff of the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, D.C., hoping to be promoted to command of a patrol torpedo boat, but due to his ongoing health problems, this didn't seem likely, though he did manage to persuade Massachusetts Senator David Walsh to assign him to a boat in the South Pacific. And by 1943, he was then assigned command of PT-109, a torpedo boat stationed in the Solomon Islands. On August 1st that year, the 109 actually spotted a Japanese destroyer and attempted to attack, but was instead completely cut in half by another enemy ship, the Amagiri, in which 2 crew members were killed and the remaining left stranded at sea. Kennedy and the surviving crew did manage to make their way over to Plum Pudding Island, 3.5 miles away. There, they made various forays through the Coral Islands looking for help, eventually coming across an English-speaking native with a canoe. Kennedy carved his location into a coconut and sent the native to find help, leading to their rescue 7 days later. This entire ordeal was heavily publicised, launching JFK into the spotlight long before his career in politics had even begun. He earned the Purple Heart and the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, and it fully established him as a brave leader. Unfortunately, this luck wouldn't continue on August 12, 1944, when his brother Joe Jr. was tragically killed in the line of duty when the bombs inside his own aircraft detonated prematurely, devastating John and his entire family. Just a month after his own recovery, Kennedy returned to active duty, commanding the PT-59, and on November 2nd, he took part in an operation that successfully rescued 50 Marines. However, just a few weeks later on the 28th, JFK was relieved of command on doctor's orders. By December, his health continued to decline, forcing him to leave the Pacific Front entirely and head to San Francisco, and was officially relieved from active duty. Between January and February of 1945, Kennedy spent more time recovering at Castle Hot Springs in Arizona, and on March the 1st, he was honorably discharged with the full rank of lieutenant. By April, John's father, who was a friend of famous media mogul William Randolph Hearst, arranged for his son to work as a special correspondent for Hearst newspaper. Furthermore, before his death, he had wanted John's brother Joe to become the family's political standard bearer and to seek presidency. But after his untimely death, this expectation now fell onto JFK himself. By the summer, Joe made a special attempt to renew the family's presence in Massachusetts with a ship launching ceremony for the USS Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. to remind voters that 2 of his sons were war heroes. Boston Mayor Maurice J. Tobin discussed the possibility of JFK becoming his running mate in 1946 as a candidate for lieutenant governor, but his father Joe preferred a congressional campaign that could send John to Washington where he could be more visible on a national scale. That year, at Joe Kennedy's insistence, US Representative Michael Curley vacated his seat in the House of Representatives to become mayor of Boston. At this point, JFK actually won the Democratic primary to replace him, thanks to his father financing his campaign. John then proceeded to campaign around the Boston area, calling for better housing for veterans, better healthcare for the public, and support for organized labor's campaign for reasonable work hours, a healthy workplace, and the rights to organize, bargain, and strike. He also campaigned for peace through the United Nations and strong opposition to the Soviet Union. That same year, the Republicans took control of the House, but JFK still managed to beat his Republican vote in the general election and was then elected to Congress. Kennedy then spent the next 6 years in the House, mainly focusing on international affairs and the emerging Cold War. Although he wasn't as anti-communist as Wisconsin Senator and previous World War II veteran Joseph McCarthy, Kennedy still supported the Immigration and Equality Act of 1952, which required communists to register to the government, and he was against the rise of the Communist Party in China. In November 1947, JFK delivered a speech in which he supported a $227 million aid package to Italy to prevent communism from brewing there. He mainly did this in an attempt to appeal to the large population of Italian migrants in Massachusetts to keep their votes, which was the first sign that he was positioning himself for statewide office. In 1949, John planned to run for the Senate 3 years later against Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who was the Republican senator for Massachusetts at the time. This was once again funded by John's father, as his brother Robert acted as his campaign manager, and his mother and sisters also held a series of tea parties at various hotels and parlors across the state to reach out to Massachusetts female voters. In 1952, JFK managed to beat Lodge by 70,000 votes to now become senator of the state. On September the 12th the following year, JFK married Jacqueline Bouvier, though most refer to her as Jackie, and they ended up having 3 children together. Arabella, who was unfortunately stillborn in 1956, Caroline in 57, and John Jr. in 1960. Unfortunately, Kennedy's health issues resurfaced, resulting in several spinal operations, which led to him frequently being absent from the Senate and almost losing his life on numerous occasions. Despite this, he developed a reputation for quickly responding to requests from his constituents, boosting his popularity further. In 1957, JFK was faced with the Civil Rights Act, which was designed to increase the protection of voting rights for African American citizens by prosecuting states that interfered with people's right to vote. However, Kennedy actually voted against it, an action viewed by some to be a way of appeasing Southern Democrats who opposed the bill. That said, John did vote for Title III of the Act, which would have given the Attorney General powers to enjoin, but as a compromise, Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson agreed to let the provision die instead. John also voted for Title IV, known as the Jury Trial Amendment, though many civil rights advocates criticised this vote, arguing that it would actually weaken the act. Regardless, the final bill was passed in September 1957. In 58, John was re-elected senator and he served until 1960, but his sights were on much bigger things. On January the 2nd that year, he announced his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination. Some people did question his experience and age, but his charisma, eloquence, and status as a war hero earned him a lot of respect and support. Furthermore, his openly Catholic faith earned him a devoted following amongst Catholic voters. And though some held anti-Catholic sentiment, the situation was diffused when Kennedy vocally supported the separation of church and state. His presidential campaign once again became a family affair, funded by Joe and managed by Robert, as John F. Kennedy became the 65th President of the United States at the age of just 43. Just a year into his run, and Kennedy authorized operations to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government in Cuba, which actually led to the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, though he did refuse to involve American troops. A year on, and he did successfully manage to de-escalate the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is widely considered to be the closest that humanity has ever come to a nuclear holocaust. When 1963 rolled around, JFK began making plans to travel to Texas in an attempt to smooth out frictions in the Democratic Party between US Senator Ralph Yarborough and conservative Governor John B. Connally Jr. JFK was to be driven through the streets of Dallas to greet the public, but though the route was finalized on November the 8th that year and publicly announced not long after, there were some safety concerns, as this particular route contained a lot of twists and turns, meaning that the vehicle would have to slow down an awful lot, possibly possibly putting the president at risk. Especially considering this route would pass by around 20,000 windows, but the authorities just didn't have enough manpower to cover every single one of them. So they decided to secure none of them. But nobody could have imagined what would happen next. Lee Harvey Oswald was born on October the 18th, 1939 to World War I Sergeant Robert and his wife Marguerite, with his older brother Robert Jr. and half-brother John Edward Pick. Sadly, just 2 months after Lee was born, his father tragically died from a heart attack. In 1944, Marguerite decided to move the family from New Orleans, Louisiana over to Dallas, Texas. And the following year, Oswald began going to school but would end up attending several different ones in the Fort Worth area. He was an average student with an IQ of 103, but was described as being very withdrawn and volatile, at one point even chasing his half-brother with a knife. In August 1952, Lee was taken by his mother to live in New York with his half-brother John, where he attended 7th grade in the Bronx but frequently played truant, leading to a psychiatric assessment at a juvenile reformatory. He was classed as being immersed in a vivid fantasy life to compensate for his present shortcomings, and was diagnosed with schizoid features and passive-aggressive tendencies. It was recommended that he would be put on probation on the condition that he seeks help from a child guidance clinic. Some social workers actually interviewed both Lee and his mother, and they found her to have been quite neglectful of her son, viewing him as a burden for her to tolerate, and claiming that she just didn't seem to understand that his behaviour was an act of rebellion against her neglect. In the autumn of 1953, Lee went back to school, but his issues only worsened, to the point the authorities sought a court order to have him removed from his mother's care. By January, both he and his mum were asked to leave when they got into an argument, and Oswald allegedly assaulted her and even threatened John's wife with a switchblade, which prevented the New York family court system from addressing the case. They had no choice but to return to New Orleans for Oswald to complete the 8th and 9th grade. By 1955, he did begin the 10th grade, but dropped out after just 4 weeks, instead working for several months as an office clerk and messenger. By July the following year, his mother moved them over to Fort Worth, Texas, where Lee enrolled at Arlington Heights High School, but like before, he quit after just a few weeks in October, never returning for his high school diploma. Despite struggling to read, he did still try to do so quite a lot and held strong socialist beliefs, even writing to the Socialist Party of America for information on their Young People's Socialist League. On October the 24th, 1956, at the age of just 17, Oswald joined the Marines. His brother Robert, who was also a soldier and who Lee truly idolized, actually signed permission as his legal guardian, which is when Oswald was trained and tested in shooting firearms. He quickly earned the name Ozzy Rabbit after the cartoon character, and Oswaldskevich due to his tendency to spout pro-Soviet sentiments. His accuracy on the range was so impressive that by December 1956, he scored 212 in his exams and earned the title of sharpshooter, though years later he would only score 191, reducing his rank to marksman. However, during his time in the army, he was frequently punished. He accidentally shot himself in the elbow with an unauthorized .22 caliber handgun, and so was court-martialed. He received the same treatment again after he was caught fighting with the sergeant who he believed was responsible for the first punishment. He was also then demoted from private first class to private, and briefly imprisoned. And a third punishment came when he was on nighttime duty in the Philippines, and inexplicably fired his rifle into the jungle. During this time, he began to learn rudimentary Russian and was invited to take a Marine proficiency exam written and spoken in the language, but he performed poorly and was described as being not very good at it. On September the 11th, 1959, Oswald was given a hardship discharge from active service after claiming that his mother needed care, which is when he spent 2 days with her before traveling to the Soviet Union. He had saved $1,500 of his Marine Corps salary before, on September the 20th, leaving his mother and heading to Le Havre, France, before continuing on to the United Kingdom, arriving in Southampton on October the 9th. Once there, he informed officials that he had $700 saved up, up, and that he planned to only stay for a week before heading to school in Switzerland. Instead, however, he flew over to Helsinki to stay at the Hotel Torni and was issued a temporary visa on the 14th. The next day, Oswald boarded a train leaving Helsinki and arriving in Moscow on the 16th, but he was running out of time as his visa actually expired on the 21st. But when that date came and went, his application to become a Soviet citizen was rejected, and he had no choice but to leave the country immediately. However, Oswald went back to his room and attempted suicide in his bathtub, which now delayed his deportation as he had to be kept in hospital under strict supervision until the 28th. On Halloween, Oswald appeared at the US Embassy in Moscow, demanding to renounce his US citizenship, threatening to reveal vital information concerning the Marine Corps otherwise, which would be of particular interest to the Soviets, which is when his discharge was then changed to undesirable due to his mental state. Oswald wanted to attend the Moscow State University, but in January 1960 he was instead sent to Minsk to work as a lathe operator at the Gorizont Electronics factory, producing radios, televisions, and military and space electronics. There, Stanislaw Shushkevich was hired to try to improve Oswald's Russian, and Lee was even given a fully furnished studio apartment, living by working-class Soviet standards, but under constant surveillance. In the middle of 1960, he formed a relationship with one of his colleagues, Ella German, who described him as a pleasant-looking guy with a good sense of humour, who wasn't as rough and rude as the other men in the area back then, though she did admit that she didn't love him, and only dated him out of pity as he seemed incredibly lonely. The relationship began to suffer in October that year when she found out that he had been seeing other women behind her back. On January the 2nd, 1961, Oswald actually proposed to her, but she turned him down, and the pair went their separate ways. Life began to deteriorate for Oswald, who wrote in his journal that same month,
"I am starting to reconsider my desire about staying. The work is drab. The money I get had nowhere to be spent. No nightclubs or bowling alleys. No places of recreation except the trade union dances. I have had enough."
He soon wrote to the US Embassy requesting his American passport back and wanting to return to the States and for them to drop any charges against him. In March 1961, Oswald met 19-year-old pharmacology student Marina Prusakova, and the two formed a relationship, even marrying just 6 weeks later. And on February the 15th the following year, they welcomed their daughter June to the world. On May the 24th, 1962, Oswald and Marina applied to the United States Embassy in Moscow for her to be able to immigrate to the US. And on June the 1st, the country actually provided Oswald with a repatriation loan of $435.71 before the family left for the United States, settling in the Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas area. They soon became acquainted with some anti-communist Russian and East European immigrants in the area, but the majority of them sympathized with Marina and only barely tolerated Oswald, who came across as rude and extremely arrogant. However, they soon gave up hope with Marina as well, as she showed no signs of ever leaving him. During this time, Oswald made friends with a 51-year-old Russian by the name of George de Morgenstield, who actually commended Oswald for his impressive and supposedly fluent Russian by this point. In July 1962, Oswald was hired by the Leslie Welding Company in Dallas, Texas as a sheet metal worker, but he hated the job and quit after just 3 months. On October the 12th, he began work for a graphics art firm as a photo print trainee, but several employees described Oswald as being incredibly rude, which led to several fights breaking out and ultimately caused him to be fired a few months into the following year. In March 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald, under the alias A. Hidell, purchased a 6.5mm caliber Carcano rifle and an '83 Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver. And on April the 10th the following month, US Major General Edwin Walker was nearly assassinated. The gunman shot at him from less than 100 feet away at the window from where he sat at his desk in his Dallas, Texas home. Thankfully, the bullet only hit the window frame, and he merely suffered some minor bullet fragments to the arm. Walker was a heavy anti-communist and segregationist, but was previously relieved of command of the 24th Division of the United States Army in West Germany for distributing right-wing literature to the troops. He also opposed racial integration at the University of Mississippi and was arrested on charges of insurrection and seditious conspiracy. Walker was temporarily held in a mental institution under the orders of Robert Kennedy, but the jury refused to indict him. Marina Oswald did later admit that her husband told her that he had travelled by bus to Walker's home, and that he had even confessed to trying to shoot him. She claimed that Oswald believed that Walker was the leader of a fascist organisation, and claimed that her husband even left her a note disclosing what she needed to do if he weren't to return home, though she wouldn't find this note until months later. At the time, there were no suspects in the Walker shooting. The bullet was far too damaged to run any studies on it, so it was left an entire mystery, though it would later be concluded that it was most likely from the same rifle that Oswald had previously purchased. On April 14, 1963, George D. Morgenstield and his wife Jean visited the Oswalds. Marina decided to give Jean a tour of the apartment when they came across Oswald's rifle standing upright leaning against a wall inside a closet. She informed her husband, and George joked to Oswald,
"Were you the one who took a pot shot at General Walker?"
He claimed that Oswald simply let out a small smile, while Jean admitted that she didn't notice any bizarre reaction. They all simply laughed at the joke, and truly didn't believe that he was actually capable of such a thing. On May 10th, 1963, Oswald was hired by the Riley Coffee Company as a machinery greaser, but he was fired not long after for extremely unsatisfactory work, and for spending far too much time loitering in the garage next door, reading rifle and hunting magazines rather than actually working. There was one claim that he was actually across the street at 544 Camp Street at the law offices of former FBI agent Guy Bannister, an avid segregationist and local politician, who was supposedly trying to use Oswald as a spy to infiltrate the Fair Play for Cuba committee, but it's unclear if this has any truth behind it. On May 26th, Oswald wrote to the same committee requesting to rent a small office.
At my own expense for the purpose of forming an FPCC branch here in New Orleans.
They responded 3 days later advising him against this, but he decided to do it anyway. On the 29th, Oswald ordered 500 application forms, 300 membership cards, and 1,000 leaflets with the heading "Hands Off Cuba," and he asked Marina to sign the name A.J. Hidell as the president on the membership card. On August the 5th and 6th, anti-Castro militant Carlos Bringue claimed that his store in New Orleans was visited by Lee Harvey Oswald, possibly in an attempt to try to infiltrate his group. On the 9th, he was then seen handing out pro-Castro leaflets downtown, leading to a confrontation from Bringue. This led to a scuffle before Oswald, Bringue, and 2 of his friends were all arrested for disturbing the peace. After leaving the police station, Oswald informed an FBI agent that he was a member of the New Orleans branch of the Fair Play for Cuba committee, claiming that it had 35 members, led by A.J. Hidell. In reality, he was the only member, and it had never even been chartered by the national organization. Regardless of this arrest, he was seen again on the 16th handing out leaflets once more in front of the International Trade Mart. On September the 23rd, 1963, Marina and her daughter June left New Orleans to live with her friend Ruth Payne in Irving, Texas, near Dallas. Oswald would remain in New Orleans for 2 more days to collect his $33 unemployment check before boarding a bus to Houston on September the 26th, but then instead heading for the Mexican border. Oswald informed other passengers that he was actually heading for Cuba. On the 27th, he had arrived in Mexico City and applied for a transit visa at the Cuban consulate, claiming that he wanted to visit Cuba en route to the Soviet Union. However, he was informed that he would need Soviet approval, which he was unable to gain, being told that he spoke terrible and hardly recognizable Russian. On October the 2nd, Oswald left Mexico City by bus and arrived back in Dallas the following day. By the 14th, Ruth Payne's neighbor informed her that there was a job opening at the Texas School Book Depository where their brother Wesley Frazier worked, leading to Oswald interviewing and being hired on the 16th for $1.25 an hour. His supervisor, Roy S. Truly, claimed that Oswald did a good day's work and was an above-average employee. He didn't drive, so he would spend Monday to Friday in the Dallas rooming house under the name O.H. Lee before being driven home by Wesley back to Irving, Texas for the weekend to be with his wife and daughter. Oswald's Soviet visa was declined, but on October the 18th, it was actually reassessed and approved. However, he was already back in the United States at this point and had given up hope to visit Cuba and the Soviet Union, writing to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C.
Had I been able to reach the Soviet embassy in Havana as planned, the embassy there would have had time to complete our business.
This visit to Mexico was investigated to confirm whether this actually was Lee Harvey Oswald or an imposter. Though nothing is for certain, it was concluded that it was most likely the real deal, trying to make necessary arrangements for an escape after what he had planned. On October the 20th, 1963, Marina gave birth to their second daughter, Audrey, but things began to get worse for Oswald. His visits to the Soviet embassy in Mexico were raised to the attention of the Dallas branch of the FBI, now making him a possible espionage case. In early November, FBI agents visited their home twice, but both times Oswald wasn't there, though they did speak with Ruth. This led to Lee himself visiting the Dallas FBI office, asking to speak to Special Agent James P. Hosty. However, he wasn't available, so Oswald left a note, and the secretary claimed that it read,
"Let this be a warning. I will blow up the FBI and the Dallas Police Department if you don't stop bothering my wife, Lee Harvey Oswald."
However, Hosty himself disputed this and claimed that it actually said,
"If you have anything you want to learn about me, come talk to me directly. If you don't cease bothering my wife, I will take the appropriate action and report this to the proper authorities."
It's unclear which account is correct, as Hosty actually destroyed the note at the advice of his lawyer after Oswald was later arrested. Furthermore, the FBI were fully aware of Lee Harvey Oswald, but hadn't informed the Secret Service. And likewise, the Secret Service knew of the route that the president would be taking, but didn't inform the FBI, who would have been fully aware that Lee Harvey Oswald was working in the area and could have been a danger. On November the 21st, 1963, strangely, Oswald asked Frazier for a lift back home to Irving during the week to pick up some curtain rods. The next day, he returned back to Dallas, leaving behind $170 and his wedding ring, but taking a large paper bag, which he told Frazier contained curtain rods. In reality, it was his Carcano rifle, and he was about to make history. On November the 22nd, 1963, US President John F. Kennedy arrived at Dallas Love Field at around 11:40 a.m., where he and his wife boarded a 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible limousine to head to the center of Dallas, Texas. This was driven by Secret Service agent Bill Greer, and also in the car was Special Agent Roy Kellerman in the front passenger seat, and Governor Connolly and his wife Nellie just in front of the Kennedys. The limousine was also followed closely by 4 Dallas police motorcycles. The plan was to drive JFK through 10 miles of Dallas, giving him maximum exposure to crowds whilst passing through the suburban section of the city as well as downtown. They had previously been warned of potential hostile protesters, but all warnings were ignored. The majority of the drive went smoothly as John was welcomed warmly by the crowds, but he then entered Dealey Plaza at 12:30, which is when his last words came. Nellie turned around and said,
"Mr. President, they can't make you believe now that there are not some in Dallas who love and appreciate you, can't they?"
To which JFK responded,
"No, they sure can't."
Once reaching Houston Street, the limousine turned onto Elm, passing the Texas School Book Depository, but that's when tragedy struck. JFK began waving to the enthusiastic crowd, and at that moment there was a gunshot. Only some witnesses claim to have heard it, but most in the crowd and the car didn't, or just didn't react, as they believed that it was a firecracker or a car backfire. However, multiple gunshots were then heard, and around 80% of witnesses at the scene recalled hearing 3 shots in total, and that the second and third were bunched together. John was waving to the crowds on his right when suddenly a shot entered his upper back and came out of his throat just below his larynx. He quickly raised his elbows and clenched his fists in front of his face and neck before leaning forwards. His wife began putting her arms around him, and although this was a serious wound, he would have been able to survive this. Connolly was an experienced hunter, and he immediately recognized the sound as that of a rifle. He quickly turned his head and torso to the right, but didn't notice anything unusual behind him, but did admit that he couldn't see JFK, so he began turning forward again. And at this point, he was struck in the upper right back by another shot, which he didn't hear, and he exclaimed,
"My God, they're going to kill us all!"
The limousine proceeded to pass a grassy knoll when Kennedy was hit again in the head, but it's always remained unclear if this was the second or third gunshot. Mrs. Kennedy can be seen climbing onto the back of the limousine, but she later claimed that she had no memory of doing this, though it's believed that she was in a state of sheer panic and was attempting to retrieve pieces of her husband's skull. She reportedly said to the other occupants in the car,
"They have killed my husband. I have his brains in my hand."
James Tague was an innocent bystander, and he was struck by either a bullet or fragments from the curb, but only received a minor wound to the cheek. The President of the United States of America had been assassinated, in broad daylight, on camera. It was at 12:36 p.m. when teenager Amos Ewins informed the police that he had seen a colored man leaning out of the window with a rifle on the 6th floor of the depository during the assassination. At this point, Sergeant D.V. Harkness sealed off the depository, but Howard Brennan then stepped forward to claim that he saw a white man in khaki clothing in the exact same window.
After the second shot, this man was aiming for his last shot and maybe paused for another second as though to assure himself that he had hit his mark.
This was corroborated by James R. Worrell Jr., who also claimed to have seen the gun from the same area. Bonnie Ray Williams was on the floor below and claimed that the rifle was so loud above him the ceiling plaster actually fell onto his head. At 12:38, Kennedy arrived at the emergency room at Parkland Memorial Hospital, still alive, but the physician George Berkeley knew instantly that he wasn't going to make it. They attempted cardiac massage, but he was pronounced dead by 1 p.m., just 30 minutes after the shooting. Arriving at the infamous window, officers found an Italian Carcano M91 38 bolt-action rifle with a palm print and some fibers on it. A bullet on Connolly's hospital gurney and 2 fragments found inside the limousine were confirmed to have come from this very weapon. Officials began conducting a roll call of all employees of the depository, which is when Roy Truly came forward to notify them that he was missing Lee Harvey Oswald. He was allegedly spotted in a library in Oak Cliff, and this was raided only to find out that it wasn't him. After the shooting, Oswald left the depository and then took a bus to his boarding house, picking up a jacket and a revolver. At 1:12, Oswald was spotted by police officer J.D. Tippett in the Oak Cliff area, and called him over to his patrol car. They had a brief exchange before Tippett exited the vehicle, and Oswald then shot him 3 times in the chest. Tippett lay on the ground in agony before Lee shot him one final time in the temple to kill him, before casually walking away. It wasn't until 1:36 p.m. when Oswald was spotted sneaking into the Texas Theater without paying, and the police were called in. Upon arrival, he did try to resist, but soon drew an empty gun and surrendered. Upon investigation, Oswald's palm print matched the one found on the weapon, and the fibers also matched the shirt that he was wearing at the time. But he still denied being involved in the assassination, and claimed that he was being targeted as a patsy because he had lived in the Soviet Union. Between November the 22nd and 24th, Oswald was questioned extensively, but always denied any involvement, though he provided statements and alibis that were all proven to have been false. Tests were administered on his hands and right cheek to determine if he had recently fired a weapon or not, and the results came back positive for the hands but negative for the cheek, though these tests aren't entirely reliable. The police even forced Oswald to host public press conferences, which angered others as it now just put him at risk of another possible assassination without them actually finding out the truth. On November the 24th, 1963, at 11:21 a.m., Lee Harvey Oswald was escorted in a car to the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters to be taken to the city jail, when he was suddenly shot by Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby during a live television broadcast. Oswald was rushed to the same hospital and was treated by the exact same surgeons who attempted to save Kennedy's life. However, the bullet had entered Oswald's lower left chest, but didn't exit, so it had severed major heart blood vessels, as well as the spleen, kidney, and liver. Despite their best efforts, Lee Harvey Oswald was pronounced dead at 1:07 p.m., possibly taking all of the answers to his grave. Ruby was immediately arrested, but he claimed to have been completely distraught over JFK's murder, and he felt like he was saving Mrs. Kennedy the discomfort of coming back to trial. He admitted that it was a spur-of-the-moment decision, and he didn't really think about the consequences. His lawyer actually tried to argue that Ruby had an episode of psychomotor epilepsy, and therefore wasn't responsible for his own actions. He was convicted, but this was actually overturned. However, as he awaited a retrial a few years later, he did pass away from a pulmonary embolism in the exact same hospital as JFK and Lee Harvey Oswald. Some believe that Ruby killed Oswald to keep him quiet, as he knew that others were involved in the assassination, and that he didn't work alone. Jack Ruby allegedly had some connections to the Mafia, leading to some speculation that Ruby had worked alongside Oswald and the CIA to kill John F. Kennedy. But with all parties dead, it's unlikely we'll ever find out the truth. Once Kennedy's autopsy came to pass, this received criticism, as it could have helped answer vital questions in the case, mostly regarding the entry or exit wound of the bullet in the skull. However, Kennedy's brain had mysteriously been removed from the National Archives, some believing that this was to cover up the fact that there were multiple shooters, while others believed that his brother Robert Kennedy destroyed it to try to hide the extent of JFK's illnesses. With Kennedy now dead, Lyndon B. Johnson took over as the president and received a report claiming that Oswald was the sole culprit in killing Kennedy, but he demanded a complete investigation by the FBI. Despite all of the eyewitness accounts and tapes recording the tragic event, there's always been controversy surrounding the assassination, mostly involving Lee Harvey Oswald not being the sole shooter. Supposedly, both Connolly and Kennedy were hit by the same bullet, a theory that would mean that it hit John in the back, exited out of his throat, then hit Connolly in the back, destroying some of his ribs, exited his chest, puncturing his lung, and then proceeded to enter his arm and shattered his right radius bone, exited his wrist, and then finally ended up in his left thigh, but still somehow remaining completely intact, now known as the magic bullet theory, suggesting that a second gunman was elsewhere, possibly by the grassy knoll, firing the fatal shot instead. Even Connolly himself refused to believe that they were struck with the same bullet. Abraham Zapruder was filming the drive of the president at the time, and this footage would end up being heavily analysed over the years to try to find out the truth. However, Orville Nix was filming from a different angle. Unfortunately, he used a Type A film, which was specifically designed to shoot indoors, so it didn't have as much light as the other tape. This footage showed the grassy knoll in the background during the assassination, and those who claim to have seen this tape admit that you can see puffs of smoke, possibly from gunfire, coming from the grassy knoll. Due to the investigation, Nix handed the tape over to the FBI on December the 1st, 1963, and it was returned to him just 3 days later. The United Press International actually bought the copyright of the tape for $5,000, but once the UPI returned the copyright and all of the footage to the family years later, the original version was missing. Nix admitted that he believed at the time that the shots came from behind the grassy knoll, but since he was told that the evidence suggested otherwise, he was then convinced that Oswald was the sole shooter. As Kennedy was rushed for emergency care, several witnesses on the scene ducked for cover, while police officers ran up the grassy knoll to find the shooter, but nobody was behind the fence. 78 were unsure where the shots came from, 49 believed that they originated from the depository, and only 21 were convinced that they were from the grassy knoll. But nobody was able to report seeing anyone with a gun or otherwise behind the picket fence there. Lee Bowers was actually in a switch tower behind that very fence and had a clear view of the only route the shooter could have taken if they did in fact fire from the grassy knoll, and he saw nobody leaving the scene. However, he did admit that 1 or 2 men were between him and the fence during the assassination itself. One was a parking lot attendant and the other wore a uniform like a county courthouse custodian. He did admit that, at the time of the assassination, he did see some commotion around the grassy knoll area.
Something out of the ordinary, a sort of milling around, but something occurred in this particular spot, which was out of the ordinary, which attracted my eye for some reason, which I could not identify.
Regardless, it was officially concluded that Oswald had acted alone, citing his Marxism, violent tendencies, failure to form personal relationships, and his desire to become significant in history as possible motives. On December the 9th, 1963, after 25,000 interviews, writing 2,300 reports, and with a total of 169 FBI agents, they concluded that 3 bullets had been fired. One hitting Kennedy in the back, the second hitting Connolly, and the third being the fatal headshot. However, upon closer examination of the footage, this was called into question. It was believed that the reaction times of Kennedy and Connolly from being shot were far too close together to have been caused by 2 bullets from the same gun from Oswald, as he would have needed 2.3 seconds just to reload. In May 1964, they were actually able to replicate the trajectory of the magic bullet in the area, and it did perfectly fall in line with the wounds found on the 2 men. Forensic pathologists have defended this theory, claiming that although the bullet survived a long journey and remained intact, it was still fundamentally deformed, and based on their positioning, with Connolly being on a lower seat than JFK, it was actually possible. However, Secret Service agent Paul Landis claimed that he actually retrieved the magic bullet from JFK's seat when he arrived at the hospital and placed it on the stretcher, believing that it dislodged from Kennedy's back and therefore didn't even make it to Connolly. One theory is that Lyndon B. Johnson decided to have JFK assassinated. 3 years prior, Johnson had attempted to take the Democratic nomination from Kennedy at a convention in Los Angeles. According to the book The Death of a President, Johnson had previously asked JFK to continue doing part of his job as the Senator of Texas. There were also rumors that Johnson may be dropped from the re-election ticket the following year, and he and Kennedy did exchange words just the day before the assassination. Furthermore, JFK was reluctant to go to Texas in the first place. The trip was an attempt to solve the political crisis in the state, but this was Johnson's turf, and Kennedy believed that he should have had it handled, despite LBJ no longer having any political control over Texas. But this may have been a motive, as the state was necessary for the re-election. Johnson was actually the one who talked JFK into going to Texas that day. In fact, Johnson's partner had even been warned by Texas lawyer Byron Skelton that, due to the political climate in Dallas at the time, it wasn't safe, and he feared for Kennedy's safety. Though Robert Kennedy was informed of this warning, JFK wasn't. A woman by the name of Madeline Brown also claimed to have had an affair with Lyndon B. Johnson, and claimed that she had attended a party with him, Richard Nixon, and J. Edgar Hoover the night before the assassination. She even claimed that Johnson whispered to her that night,
After tomorrow, those Kennedys will never embarrass me again. That's no threat. That's a promise.
However, not only did Lyndon B. Johnson help to set up the Warren Commission to investigate the entire case, but he was proven to have been on the Texas Strip the night beforehand and not at the party, dismissing Madeline's entire story. On February the 22nd, 1967, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison announced his investigation on the case, which brings forth our next suspect, David Ferrie. Born on March 28, 1918 in Cleveland, Ohio, Ferrie spent 3 years at St. Charles Seminary in Cartagena, but in 1944 he left due to emotional instability. Ferrie soon gained a pilot's license and began teaching aeronautics at Cleveland's Benedictine High School. However, this didn't last long as he was fired for taking young boys to a house of prostitution before becoming an insurance inspector. In 1951, he relocated to New Orleans where he worked as a pilot for Eastern Airlines, but by August that year he was fired after he was arrested twice on morals charges. He became involved with the Civil Air Patrol and started work as a senior member with the 5th Cleveland Squadron at Hopkins Airport. He would then return to New Orleans and transfer to Lakefront Airport, serving as an instructor and then a commander. However, in December 1954, one of his students crashed a plane and tragically died, leading to Ferrie's annual reappointment being declined. He requested to be a guest aerospace education instructor at a smaller squadron, even lecturing there between June and September 1955. By September in 59, he was reinstated as executive officer, and by June the following year, a disagreement during a military camp led to him quitting the squadron and starting his own unofficial one in September, though Ferrie would use this to develop improper relations with young boys between the ages of 14 and 18 years old. By August 1961, due to his frequent arrests, his squadron had no choice but to shut down. Many described Ferrie as liberal and rabidly anti-communist. He had previously accused many US presidents of being sellouts to communism. He also supported Castro's campaign against Fulgencio Batista in Cuba, though he would later turn on Castro, believing that he was a communist. Ferrie ended up finding an outlet for his political fanaticism within the anti-Castro movement. At the beginning of 1961, Ferrie was working with right-wing Cuban exile Sergio Arcaca Smith, who was the head of the CIA in New Orleans, and even became his partner. By the end of that year, they were both involved in a raid on a munitions depot in Homer, Louisiana, stealing several weapons, grenades, and ammunition. In July that year, Ferrie actually gave an anti-Kennedy speech discussing the presidential administration and the Bay of Pigs invasion. He insulted JFK for refusing to provide air support during the invasion, and Ferrie was then forced off of the podium. He would later admit to saying things like, "Kennedy ought to be shot," but claimed that they were merely an offhand comment or a colloquial expression, and that he didn't actually mean anything by them. It was around this time when Ferrie became associated with Guy Bannister, who helped him in a dispute against the Eastern Airlines regarding charges that had been brought against him.
An unconfirmed Border Patrol report of February 1962 alleges that Ferrie was the pilot who flew Carlos Marcello back into the United States from Guatemala after he had been deported in April 1961 as part of U.S. General Robert F. Kennedy's crackdown on organized crime.
However, on the day of the assassination, Marcello was acquitted in the deportation case. That same day, Guy Bannister and one of his employees, Jack Martin, shared some drinks at a local bar. But once returning to Bannister's office, an argument began, with Martin claiming,
"What are you going to do? Kill me like you all did Kennedy?"
At this point, Bannister drew a .357 Magnum revolver and pistol-whipped Martin several times, leading to him being sent to hospital. Bannister's longtime friend and secretary, Delphine Roberts, initially denied ever seeing Lee Harvey Oswald with Guy Bannister, but she later changed her story and claimed that she saw him in his office several times, even once with his wife.
Oswald seemed to be on familiar terms with Bannister and with his office. As I understood it, he had the use of an office on the second floor above the main office where we worked. Then, several times, Mr. Bannister brought me upstairs, and in the office above, I saw various writings stuck on the wall pertaining to Cuba. There were various leaflets up there pertaining to fair play for Cuba.
In the days that followed, Martin claimed that David Ferrie may have actually been involved in the assassination. He claimed that Ferrie was supposed to be the getaway pilot, claiming that he had previously threatened JFK's life, outlined plans to kill him, and that he may have actually taught Oswald how to use a rifle with a telescopic sight. He claimed that Ferrie knew Oswald from their days back in the New Orleans Civil Air Patrol, and that there was a photo of them together in Ferrie's home. He even claimed to have heard that Ferrie's own library card was found on Oswald when he was arrested, but this was looked into and proven to have been false. On November the 27th, 1963, David Ferrie was interviewed and actually able to provide that same library card in question. Martin also claimed that Ferrie may have even hypnotized Oswald into performing the hit, but the FBI considered these claims to have been mostly unreliable. He also claimed that Ferrie had driven down from New Orleans to Texas that night. While Ferrie admitted to driving 350 miles, he claimed that he was actually heading to the Winterland skating rink in Houston.
I had been considering for some time the feasibility and possibility of opening an ice skating rink in New Orleans and wanted to gather information on the ice rink business.
David Ferrie was interviewed twice, and though he admitted to making several public and private statements criticizing JFK, he denied being involved in the assassination. He also denied even meeting Lee Harvey Oswald, but claimed that if he did, it would have been in casual passing. Some believe that Martin just had a grudge with David Ferrie and was trying to point the blame to him as he had failed to get him a job in the past and proceeded to slander him at every possible opportunity. The FBI interviewed 20 people regarding Martin's claims, but none were able to corroborate his story. Upon finding out about the allegations concerning him, Ferrie even contacted former Civil Air Patrol associates for more information on Oswald. Allegedly, just the day after the news broke that Jim Garrison was taking over the case, David Ferrie called up his friend Lou Ivan and claimed,
"You know what this news story does to me, don't you? I'm a dead man. From here on, believe me, I'm a dead man."
3 days later, and David Ferrie was found dead. Inside his apartment were 2 unsigned and undated letters typed out, one of which read,
"To leave this life is, for me, a sweet prospect."
The second was merely written to his friend Al Bowerbuff, leaving behind his possessions. Garrison concluded that it was suicide, but he wasn't going to rule out the possibility of foul play. However, once they conducted the autopsy, there was no evidence of either, and it seemed like he had actually died from a cerebral hemorrhage due to a congenital intracranial berry aneurysm which ruptured his brain. It seemed that the man had coincidentally written 2 suicide notes and then died from natural causes anyway. On March 1st, 1967, Garrison arrested businessman Clay Shaw on suspicion of conspiring to murder the president, along with the deceased Oswald and David Ferrie. But he also questioned Perry Russo, despite Clay Shaw being described as being the unlikeliest villain since Oscar Wilde. Clay Shaw was born on March 17th, 1913, growing up to enlist in the Second World War, being assigned to the Medical Corps as a private. After the war, he gained work helping the International Trade Mart in New Orleans. Though not confirmed, Garrison was convinced that Shaw used the alias Clay Bertrand within the gay society. Perry Russo was born on May 14th, 1941 in New Orleans and grew up to become an insurance salesman. Not long after David Ferrie died, Perry came forward to claim that he had told him a month before the assassination,
"We will get him and it won't be long. You know we can get Kennedy if we want him."
Russo claimed that Oswald, Ferrie and Clay had discussed killing him, even going over the triangulation of the crossfire and planning potential alibis for everyone involved. However, Perry denied ever hearing Ferrie mention Oswald's name, and claimed that he had no idea who he was until he saw him on television covering the case. However, he did describe a roommate that Ferrie had in New Orleans as having dirty blonde hair with a husky beard, a typical beatnik and extremely dirty. Once shown a photo of Lee Harvey Oswald, he pointed him out as being Ferrie's roommate and claimed to have often seen them talking in the car at Ferrie's service station. Perry also offered to be hypnotized to remember more specific details. At that point, he was given truth serum and was able to describe a conspiracy plot that took place between Clay Shaw, Lee Harvey Oswald, and David Ferrie, with Ferrie claiming,
"We are going to kill John F. Kennedy. It won't be long."
During the trial, Shaw was questioned why he didn't immediately go to the police with Ferrie's supposed assassination plan after JFK was killed, to which Shaw replied,
"I had an involvement with school, which was more pressing to me."
Shaw even claimed that 2 people would be able to corroborate his story, but this failed. One was an ex-girlfriend who appeared on NBC News and denied being at Ferrie's apartment or even meeting him until years after the assassination. The other was a friend who admitted to being at Ferrie's place but denied seeing Shaw or Oswald there. On March the 8th and June the 19th, 1967, Perry Russo was given 2 polygraph tests and failed both. Though in the second one, he openly told the examiner that his story just wasn't true.
In my conversations with Perry Russo, he has stated that his testimony against Clay Shore may be a combination of truth, fantasy, and lies. He says he wishes he had never gotten into this, but now he feels he had no choice but to go through with it. He said he's afraid if he changed his testimony, that Garrison might indict him for perjury. Russo said,
"The hell with truth, the hell with justice. You're asking me to sacrifice myself for Clay Shaw and I won't do it."
Though there was a press conference the day after the NBC broadcast, in which Russo accused Sheridan of trying to bribe him into changing his story and switching between promises and threats to try to get his help wrecking Garrison's investigation. The NBC News denied this allegation, and Sheridan even claimed that it was Russo who solicited offers from them. Russo denied ever seeing Shaw at Ferrie's apartment and claimed that Garrison had brainwashed him, maintaining that Garrison and his staff had a contract with Life magazine for $25,000 and that they offered to give him a share if he helped them. But privately, Russo would tell others that he personally saw Ferrie, Shaw, and Oswald conspire to kill John F. Kennedy.
he told me that he was caught in the middle of this thing, that if he stuck to his story, Shore and his friends and lawyers would clobber him. If he changed his story, then Garrison would charge him with perjury, and Chuck, there would go his job with equitable life. He told me all he was concerned about was his own position, that he wished he'd never opened his mouth about it, wished he could go back to the day before he shot off his mouth up in Baton Rouge.
It was in 1968 when Garrison publicly accused Shaw of murdering the president and framing Oswald for it. He was convinced that they all conspired to kill him, furious at his attempts to obtain a peace settlement in Cuba and Vietnam, and that they had set up Oswald to take the fall as a patsy. Garrison even argued that the footage clearly shows Kennedy's head being sent in a backwards motion, proving that the shooter had to have been from the grassy knoll and not the depository. Despite this, after just 54 minutes of deliberation, the jury still found Clay Shaw not guilty of being involved in the assassination.
I was a great admirer of Kennedy. I thought he had given the nation a new turn after the rather drab Eisenhower years. I felt he was vitally concerned about social issues, which concerned me also. I thought he had youth, imagination, style, and talent. All in all, I considered him a splendid president.
After the trial, attorney Mark Lane claimed that the jurors admitted that some of them did believe that he was most likely involved in some kind of conspiracy, but that there wasn't enough evidence to actually convict him for it. Though this has been disputed, as Clay Shaw's friend James Kirkwood claimed that he spoke with several of the jurors who all denied ever speaking with Lane at all. Most considered the trial a huge travesty of justice, convinced that the man had gotten away with murder, including the judge himself.
I believe he was lying to the jury. Of course, the jury probably believed him, but I think Shaw put a good con job on the jury.
Another theory is that JFK was assassinated by the Russians, who used Oswald as a KGB agent, though this has largely been dismissed as it's unlikely they would have used someone who would have been easily identified as a Russian ally. Another theory is that he was killed by the CIA and that it was covered up. JFK did have ties with Sam Giancana, who was the head of the Chicago mob, and his father Joseph Kennedy had even worked for him in the past as well. There were even rumors that Giancana and his connections had helped Kennedy win the election, and they had even both shared the same mistress, Judith Campbell Exner, previously before as well. Years after the assassination, Giancana was actually supposed to be interrogated about the case, before he too was murdered. Some believe to keep him quiet. It's been theorized that the CIA had a plot to assassinate Fidel Castro, and that JFK may have discovered this and may have had a different agenda, so they decided to eliminate him. It's been posited that the CIA had selected Oswald as he was a known communist and a Russian sympathizer. During the Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy had caused personnel changes within the CIA, which may have caused issues with them. Furthermore, Alan Dulles was the former head of the CIA working on the Warren Commission, and he admitted that they actually withheld information in it. Forensic historian Patrick Nolan wrote a book and claimed that 4 high-level agents not only planned the shooting, but that 3 of them had fired 4 shots during the assassination as well. 3 homeless people were photographed under police escort near the depository not long after the assassination, leading to accusations that they were involved, desperate to find their identities. It was years later when 2 of the men were named as being Watergate burglars E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis. They were compared to the photos, but it seemed unclear if they were actually the right people. Fred Lee Chrisman was named as being the only one who resembled the homeless people, but it was confirmed that he hadn't even been in the area on the day of the assassination. Though years later, Marita Lorenz did claim that Sturgis, who she was involved with at the time, was in fact a gunman in the assassination. Furthermore, during the aforementioned Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy refused to offer additional US military support, despite the CIA offering an umbrella of air protection, which leads to another theory. In the footage and photographs, a man can be seen holding an umbrella, despite it not raining. Furthermore, the bullet only hits just as the car passes the mysterious man, as he seems to lift it, possibly as a signal. Or one theory was even that the umbrella itself shot the bullet and was actually a weapon. Charles Sensonnet, a defense weapons developer, actually confirmed that such a weapon did exist because he had designed it. Furthermore, the man in the tape casually sits down on the curb during the panic and doesn't react like everybody else around the area. However, this man was eventually located and identified as being Louis Stephen Witt. He claimed that the umbrella was a symbol of protest against Joseph Kennedy, as he wasn't a fan of his appeasement policies. The umbrella had been used as a symbol by English Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and had become a symbol ever since. Witt also claimed that the reason he reacted so calmly afterwards was simply because the umbrella had blocked his view, so he didn't actually see the assassination taking place. In December 1967, Garrison appeared on a Dallas TV show with a photo taken at the Dealey Plaza immediately after the assassination took place, supposedly showing a federal agent in normal clothes picking up and walking away with a .45 caliber bullet. This bullet wasn't given into evidence, suggesting that another gunman was involved and it was covered up. Though Deputy Sheriff Buddy Walters confirmed that the photo was actually taken 10 minutes after the assassination took place, and therefore nothing of significance was present. On June 5th, 1968, JFK's brother Robert Kennedy followed suit and was also sadly assassinated. He was in a ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, California, when he was informed that there was a shortcut through the kitchen to the press room. Ignoring warnings from his bodyguard to avoid the kitchen, he entered anyway. It was here when 24-year-old Sirhan Sirhan opened fire with a .22 caliber revolver, sending Robert down with a similar fate to his brother. On August 15th, 1974, Clay Shaw passed away from metastatic lung cancer at the age of 61 after being a heavy smoker for most of his life. He was actually involved in a $5 million lawsuit against Garrison and members of the organization Truth and Consequences Inc., who financed the investigation, but his untimely death caused the case to be dismissed, as Shaw was a lifelong bachelor with no heirs and no surviving relatives. In 1975, President Gerald Ford established the Rockefeller Commission, determined to investigate if any domestic activities by the CIA were unlawful and to re-examine the entire case. After 5 months of the investigation, they concluded that medical examination confirmed that Kennedy had been killed by 2 shots from behind. They stated that if Garrison's claims of the backwards motions were correct, such a motion would be caused by a violent straightening and stiffening of the entire body as a result of a seizure-like neuromuscular reaction to major damage inflicted to nerve centers in the brain. They also found absolutely no evidence to suggest that the CIA were directly involved. It was in 1976 when the House Select Committee on Assassinations were formed to investigate both assassinations of Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. By 1978, they concluded that there is a strong possibility that a 4th shot was actually fired from the grassy knoll by an unknown second gunman, but they were convinced that it actually missed. They also believed that the previous investigation on Oswald being responsible was conducted thoroughly and correctly, finding no need to pursue this any further. But they were also convinced that the assassination did in fact take place because of a conspiracy. It wasn't until 1979 when former CIA Director Richard Helms admitted that Shaw had actually been a part-time contact for the Domestic Contact Service of the CIA, providing information from abroad. Polls conducted showed that most Americans were convinced that a conspiracy was involved in the assassination. Some believed that Oswald was only one of two shooters, while others believed that he was entirely innocent, a theory backed up by Oswald's own widow Marina. The government has been blamed, the CIA, the Mafia, even those involved in the investigation and the autopsy. There was also another tape of the assassination, filmed by Dave Weigman, which shows a man standing on the front steps of the depository during the shooting, who is now referred to as the Prayer Man, due to his right arm seemingly being raised across his chest. And some believe that this is actually Lee Harvey Oswald, making it impossible that he would have been on the 6th floor to shoot the president. The photo has often been analysed, describing the person as being a white man with short hair, dressed in a loose dark shirt with an open neck with either short or rolled up sleeves. Oswald always claimed to have been on the 1st floor of the building at the time of the shooting, while the official doctrine claimed that he was on the 6th. Howard Brennan was a witness who testified that the gunman looked like Lee Harvey Oswald, backed up by other people at the scene. Interestingly, some of the eyewitness accounts did claim that the clothing they saw the gunman wearing didn't match Oswald's attire at the time of his arrest, but the ones in the photo did. Many were around the steps at the time of the assassination and denied seeing Oswald there. Most believed the unidentified man was just another employee of the depository, despite nobody being able to recognize him. All 73 staff members were interviewed by the FBI and none could identify the man, and none claimed that they noticed a stranger in the building that day. Marina herself was convinced that this was her husband, but it still remains a mystery. It wasn't until over a decade later, in 1991, when the feature film named after the fallen president came out, and a huge interest in the assassination returned to the public. This led to Congress passing the JFK Records Act, allowing the National Archives to release all assassination-related documents to the public within 25 years. It was in 1993 when a photo was released showing Oswald and David Ferrie together, disproving Ferrie's claims that they had never met, though others have admitted that it doesn't actually mean anything.
I'm in the picture. I'm sure David Ferrie wouldn't remember me either.
The photo doesn't prove that they ever met or talked to each other, but only that they were in the organization at the same time.
Between 1994 and 1998, the assassination papers were gathered together, compiling of around 60,000 documents and over 4 million pages. However, even more speculation was raised when photographs of Kennedy's brain didn't seem to match the damage actually done. Furthermore, others disputed photos of JFK himself, as they vividly remembered a large wound in the back of his head, though the board blamed this on human error or lapse in memory, citing the photographs as evidence. In 2015, former Mafia hitman James Files claimed to have actually been the second shooter. He claimed that it was part of a plot between the Mafia and the CIA, but there is no evidence to back up his story, so this has been largely dismissed. That same year, Gail Nix Jackson, the granddaughter of Orville Nix, who had supposedly recorded footage from a different angle, proving there was gunfire at the grassy knoll so many years earlier, actually filed a lawsuit against the US government for $10 million, demanding compensation for the footage being lost.
It was incomprehensible authorities would lose an important piece of historical evidence. I can understand little clerical issues. I don't understand the loss of evidence like this.
In 2017, her lawsuit was dismissed without prejudice, which led to her filing another one, demanding the return of the tape and all copies, as well as $29.7 million for compensatory damages, but the outcome isn't known to the public at the time of recording this. The assassination documents wouldn't be released until 2018, though they very nearly weren't, in fear of inspiring similar attacks. It was only when President Donald Trump refused to block them from being put out. However, though some were released in April that year, he pushed some back until October 2021, which was delayed further by President Joe Biden due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Eventually, in 2022, 13,173 previously redacted documents were released to the world, with a further group of files also being revealed in June 2023, now allowing everyone in the public eye to look over this case and collectively continue seeking answers.